Picture this: a kingdom teetering on the edge of oblivion, its cities burning, its people fleeing, and its very existence about to be erased from history. The year is somewhere in the heart of the medieval era, a time when empires rose and fell with the swing of a sword. But amid the chaos, one battle, a clash most history books have overlooked, changed everything. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on that forgotten moment, the day when courage, strategy, and maybe even a stroke of divine luck saved an entire civilization from vanishing into the shadows of time. What makes this story so gripping isn't just the blood and steel of battle, it's the human drama behind it. Think about the king who refused to surrender, the general who outsmarted an army twice his size, or the ordinary soldiers who stood their ground when all hope seemed lost. This wasn't just a fight for land or power, it was a fight for survival, a desperate gamble to preserve a way of life that would have been crushed forever if not for that single, decisive showdown. And yet, ask anyone today, and chances are they've never even heard of it. How does something so pivotal just disappear from memory? That's the mystery we're unraveling in this video. Because this battle isn't just a relic of the past, it's a lesson. It's about how leadership in the darkest hour can defy the odds, how a handful of brave decisions can ripple across centuries, and how easily the threads of history can fray or hold firm. By the time we're done, you'll see the medieval world, and maybe even our own, in a whole new light. So let's step into the armor of those who fought, walk the battlefield where destiny was rewritten, and uncover the story of how one forgotten clash saved a kingdom from collapse. The kingdom was a shadow of its former glory, once a beacon of prosperity, now reduced to fractured lands and hollowed-out cities. Its borders shrank year by year, nibbled away by opportunistic neighbors who smelled weakness like wolves circling wounded prey. Inside those crumbling walls, the monarchy clung to power by a thread, its authority undermined by scheming nobles and a treasury drained by endless wars. The people, once proud subjects of a thriving realm, now whispered in hushed tones of betrayal and doom. Fields lay fallow, trade routes withered, and the roads teemed with refugees fleeing the slow unraveling of their world. What makes this collapse so tragic is how easily it's been forgotten. History remembers the grand conquests, the glittering dynasties, but rarely the quiet unraveling that comes before. While textbooks dwell on the rise of empires or the clash of famous kings, this kingdom's despair slipped through the cracks, just another nameless casualty in the medieval world's relentless churn. But that's the irony. Sometimes the most pivotal moments happen in the margins, in places the chroniclers barely glance at, and yet, amid the chaos, there were flashes of defiance. A stubborn garrison holding a frontier fort against impossible odds, a lone diplomat racing against time to secure alliances. Even the king, though weakened, refused to let the crown's legacy die without a fight. These weren't just footnotes, they were the fragile threads of hope that, against all logic, would soon weave together into salvation. Because unbeknownst to everyone, the stage was set for a battle so unexpected, so perfectly timed, that it would rewrite the kingdom's fate in a single, bloody afternoon. But to understand how that miracle happened, we first have to see just how close the end really was. The storm came not as a single wave, but as a slow, inevitable tide, an alliance of rival kingdoms and warlords, each hungry for their piece of a dying realm. To the north, the iron-fisted King Edrick of Veldros saw weakness as an invitation, his armies already carving paths through the kingdom's undefended valleys. His motivation was simple: land, fertile fields, bustling towns, and mines rich with ore, all ripe for the taking. But he wasn't alone. From the eastern marshes, Lord Harkon of the Black Banner mustered his horse lords not for conquest but for vengeance. Years earlier, the kingdom's border skirmishers had left his brother dead, and now, with the realm on its knees, he saw a chance to repay blood with blood. What made this threat so terrifying was its inevitability. Chroniclers of the time wrote of omens, black birds gathering in unnatural numbers, wells turning bitter, and peasants whispering of dreams where the sky rained fire. These weren't just superstitions, they were the echoes of a people sensing doom. The kingdom's spies brought back reports of war councils in foreign halls, of maps unrolled and borders redrawn before the fighting had even begun. One account, scribbled in the margins of a monk's diary, describes a captured scout's last words: "They're not coming to conquer, they're coming to erase." And then there was the sheer scale of the forces gathering. The northern host alone numbered in the tens of thousands, a sea of spears and painted shields led by Edrick's infamous Wolf Guard, an elite cadre of warriors sworn to fight to the last breath. Their reputation was so fearsome that entire villages along their march route emptied overnight, families fleeing with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Meanwhile, Harkon's cavalry moved like shadows, striking supply caravans and outposts with terrifying precision, leaving no survivors to spread word of their movements. The kingdom's scouts reported smoke on the horizon in every direction, a noose tightening by the day. Yet the most chilling detail, the invaders didn't see themselves as villains. Edrick's chroniclers painted him as a unifier, a king bringing order to a fractured land. Harkon's bards sang of justice, of a debt finally paid. This wasn't mindless destruction, it was calculated, even righteous in their eyes. And that made it all the more dangerous, because when conquerors believe they're justified, they don't stop. They don't negotiate, they erase. By the time the first foreign banners appeared on the horizon, the kingdom's fate seemed sealed. The roads were choked with refugees, the castles half-manned, and the royal council torn between surrender and a futile last stand. But history has a way of defying expectations, and the story of how this storm was weathered begins not with a king or an army, but with a single, overlooked fortress and the man who refused to let it fall. The forgotten battle unfolded in a place called Blackthorn Vale, a name now scrubbed from most maps, its significance buried under centuries of dust. Today, it's little more than a quiet stretch of rolling hills and scrubland, but in that fateful year, it was the kingdom's last choke point, a geographical fluke that would become its salvation. Picture a narrow valley flanked by steep, wooded slopes, its entrance guarded by crumbling stone outposts left over from an older war. The river Thresher, shallow but swift, cut through the vale's center, its banks slick with autumn mud. To an invading army, it must have seemed like just another patch of land to cross. But to the kingdom's scarred generals, it was a gift from the terrain itself, a place where numbers wouldn't matter, where a small, desperate force could hold the line against a tide. Geography, as much as courage, decided this battle. Those steep slopes funneled attackers into tight columns, turning Edrick's famed Wolf Guard into a slow-moving target. The river, swollen from early rains, split Harkon's cavalry, forcing them to ford its currents under a hail of arrows. Even the weather played its part, thick morning mists that clung to the valley floor, masking the kingdom's outnumbered defenders until it was too late for the invaders to adjust. Modern historians call it terrain leverage, but the soldiers who fought there knew it as something simpler, home ground advantage. They'd trained in these hills, hunted in these woods, and now they'd make their stand where every rock and thicket favored them. Local folklore still whispers of that day, though the details have blurred into legend. Shepherds claim to hear ghostly war horns in the valley's dawn fog, and children dare each other to pocket arrowheads still wedged in the roots of ancient oaks. A century ago, a farmer ploughing his field unearthed a rusted helm with a distinctive wolf crest Aldrich's mark, now displayed in a dusty corner of the regional museum. But the most telling clue isn't buried in the dirt, it's carved into the landscape itself. Archaeologists mapping the Vale found strange, shallow trenches along the eastern slope, too orderly to be natural, too crude for farming. The leading theory, a last-minute palisade built in the dead of night from felled trees, proof that the kingdom's defenders didn't just rely on luck. They reshaped the battlefield itself. So why was this clash forgotten? Perhaps because the victors had no time to celebrate. The kingdom, though saved, was still shattered. Its chronicles focused on rebuilding rather than glorifying a battle that smelled more of desperation than glory. Or maybe because history favors the stories of kings and crowns, not mud-stained soldiers holding a line no one thought could hold. But walk Blackthorn Vale today, and you'll feel it, the quiet weight of a place that defied oblivion. Because sometimes the ground itself remembers what the history books omit. History remembers conquerors and kings, but rarely the unlikely heroes who change its course. And the commander who stood at Blackthorn Vale was anything but legendary. His name was Edrick of Dunhold, a minor noble whose family had lost their lands years earlier to Aldrich's expansion. By all accounts, he was an afterthought, a disgraced knight relegated to garrison duty after a drunken brawl cost him his post in the royal guard. The chronicles dismiss him in a single line: a man of middling skill, prone to recklessness. But that recklessness, it turns out, was exactly what the kingdom needed. Edrick's story reads like a parable of redemption. Stripped of his titles, he'd spent years drifting between mercenary bands and border skirmishes, his reputation shadowed by rumors of gambling debts and a short temper. Yet those who served under him noted something else: an uncanny ability to read terrain, a knack for turning disadvantages into traps. He wasn't a strategist from the war colleges, he was a survivor, hardened by years of fighting in the margins. When the kingdom's high command fled east with the royal family, Edrick was left behind with a ragtag force of deserters, farmers, and a handful of aging knights who refused to abandon their posts. The moment that defined him came the night before the battle. Scouts reported Aldrich's vanguard was hours away, and Harkon's cavalry had already forded the river upstream. Panic spread through the camp until Edrick climbed onto a supply cart and did something no one expected. He laughed, not from madness but defiance. "They think they're hunting sheep," he shouted, "but we're the thorns in this valley's name." Then he laid out a plan so audacious, even his officers doubted it. Abandon the fortifications, lure the invaders into the narrowest part of the Vale, and strike from the slopes where their numbers wouldn't matter. It violated every textbook tactic, but as Edrick pointed out, we're not fighting by their rules anymore. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in desperation turned into strength. Edrick's men felled trees to block escape routes, dug pits disguised by leaves, and even herded wild boar into the enemy's path under cover of fog. When Aldrich's Wolfguard charged, they found themselves tangled in a maze of their own arrogance, their heavy armor sinking into the river mud while arrows rained from unseen archers in the trees. Harkon's cavalry, expecting a routed enemy, rode straight into a wall of spears hidden behind a feigned retreat. By midday, the invaders were fighting each other in the confusion, their alliance crumbling faster than their battle lines. Edrick didn't live to see the kingdom's recovery. He fell in the final hour, rallying his men to hold the valley's mouth. But his last act was pure irony. He died wearing Aldrich's own banner as a cloak, stripped from a captured standard-bearer. Today, a weathered stone in Blackthorn Vale marks where he fell, inscribed with the words he muttered before the charge: "Let them remember we stood." And yet, outside that valley, almost no one does. because history favors the grand narratives, the sweeping victories, not the broken men who buy time with their lives. But every kingdom has its Edricks. The difference here, this time it was enough. The invaders didn't just march into Blackthorn Vale expecting victory. They strolled in as if the battle were already won. King Aldric's war council had spent weeks poring over maps of the kingdom's heartland, its richest cities and strongholds, but the valley barely earned a scribble in the margins. One chronicler from Veldros wrote, "Our scouts called it a shepherd's pass fit for driving cattle, not armies." That dismissiveness seeped into every decision. Aldric, confident his wolf guard could smash through any resistance, didn't bother waiting for his siege engines or supply trains. He pushed ahead with only his vanguard, leaving his heavier forces strung out along muddy backroads. Meanwhile, Lord Harkon, eager to claim his pound of flesh, split his cavalry into reckless probing attacks, convinced the kingdom's defenders would flee at the first sight of his banners. The enemy's arrogance wasn't just strategic, it was cultural. For years, they'd watched this kingdom weaken, its armies retreat, its coffers empty. To them, Blackthorn Vale wasn't a battlefield, it was a parade ground. Aldric's commanders reportedly dined the night before on captured royal stores, drinking wine from the king's own cellars while joking about which noble titles they'd claim afterward. A surviving letter from one of Harkon's captains reads like a shopping list. "Reserve the eastern vineyards for my brother. The iron mines go to the crown, but the smiths, those we take." They weren't preparing for a fight. They were dividing spoils that hadn't even been won yet. This overconfidence bled into their tactics. When Aldric's scouts reported Edric's forces abandoning their fortifications, they misinterpreted desperation as surrender. "They are scattering like rats," one lieutenant scribbled in his journal. Instead of securing the high ground or sending flanking parties, the Wolf Guard charged straight up the valley's center, their heavy armor and broad shields meant for open fields, not tangled slopes. Harkon, meanwhile, ignored warnings about the river's currents, convinced his horsemen could cross anywhere. "Let the water slow the footmen," he sneered, according to a bard's later account. "My riders will be feasting in their halls by dusk." Historians would later call this the blindness of inevitability, the assumption that victory is certain simply because it feels deserved. But the terrain didn't care about their confidence. The river's currents dragged down armored knights. The narrow paths forced Aldric's columns into chaotic bottlenecks where only a handful of men could fight at once. And when Edric's ambush hit, the invaders had no contingency, no reserves to call upon. Their maps were wrong. Their scouts had missed the pitfalls and deadfall traps. Even the weather turned against them, the morning fog thickening just as Edric's archers loosed their first volleys. The cruelest twist, some of Aldric's own men saw the disaster coming. A junior officer's diary, unearthed centuries later, describes a tense argument the night before. "I begged the marshal to send riders ahead to test the valley's edges. He struck me for insolence and said, 'We are not here to hunt ghosts.'" That phrase, "hunt ghosts," would haunt the survivors, because by afternoon, that's exactly what they were doing, chasing shadows through the trees, tripping over their own dead, while a kingdom they'd written off fought like wolves at their throats. Hubris, as the old poets say, is the prelude to ruin. But in Blackthorn Vale, it wasn't just a moral lesson, it was a tactical blueprint. Edric's greatest weapon wasn't his arrows or his pit traps. It was the enemy's unshakable belief that men with nothing left to lose would simply roll over and die. And that miscalculation, more than any sword stroke, is what turned the tide. The air in Blackthorn Vale that final night hung thick with the scent of damp earth and dying campfires. On one side of the river, Aldric's wolf guard drank themselves into a stupor, their laughter carrying across the water as they passed around looted wine. A young squire's diary, smudged with candle wax, recounts how the knights gambled with stolen silver, betting on who would claim the most heads the next day. One scrawled entry reads, "The marshal says we'll breakfast in the enemy's hall. I pray he's right, my boots have leaked since the rains began." Their confidence was a living thing, fed by months of unchecked victories. But on the valley's western slope, Edrick's camp was eerily quiet. No songs, no boasts, just the occasional rasp of whetstones on blades and the murmur of scouts reporting back. A surviving letter from a foot soldier to his wife captures the mood. "We've no priests to bless us, no banners to rally under, only the dark and each other." Some men carved names into arrow shafts, not for luck, but so their bodies might be identified later. Others traded keepsakes, a rusted locket for a scrap of bread, a child's wooden toy for an extra inch of spear leather. These weren't soldiers preparing for glory. They were men steeling themselves to buy time with their lives. The omens that night were impossible to ignore. A monk traveling with Edrick's force wrote of a fox darting through camp at midnight, its pelt unnaturally white, stopping to stare at the men before vanishing into the trees. Superstitious whispers spread. Was it a spirit warning them to flee or a sign of cunning to come? Meanwhile, in Aldrich's camp, a warhorse reportedly broke its tether and galloped into the river, drowning despite the shouts of those who tried to save it. The king's astrologer dismissed it as bad footing, but the men who saw it exchanged uneasy glances. Even the stars seemed unsettled, a rare meteor shower painting the sky with streaks of light. One soldier described as the heavens sharpening their swords. What makes these details so haunting isn't just their drama, but their intimacy. History often forgets that battles aren't fought by armies, they're fought by individuals, each with their own fears and fragile hopes. That last night, a baker-turned-spearman penned a clumsy poem in the margins of a stolen ledger. "If I fall, let the wheat grow tall where I lie." A Veldro's archer sketched his sweetheart's face on his shield, then covered it with a fresh coat of paint before dawn, as if hiding his heart from what was coming. These weren't grand gestures for the history books. They were the quiet, human moments before the storm. And then there were the commanders. Aldrick, according to his squire's notes, slept soundly in a commandeered farmhouse, his armor already polished for the morning's triumph. Edrick, by contrast, didn't sleep at all. Witnesses recall him moving through camp like a shadow, stopping to tighten a strap here, share a sip of sour beer there. No speeches, no false promises, just a hand on a shoulder here and there, the unspoken understanding that tomorrow they'd stand together or not at all. When a young recruit asked if they had a chance, Edrick didn't lie. "Chance," he shrugged. "No, but we've got the ground and we've got their arrogance." That'll have to do. As the first grey light crept into the valley, both sides stirred, one to the blare of war horns and the clatter of proud formations, the other to the silent knocking of arrows and the last whispered prayers. The stage was set, the players were ready, and the Vale, indifferent as time itself, waited to see which story it would be asked to remember. The first light of dawn didn't so much break over Blackthorn Vale as it seeped in, a pale, mist-choked glow that turned the world into a patchwork of shadows and half-truths. The invaders, bleary-eyed from their revelry, formed up in neat ranks along the riverbank, their polished helmets catching slivers of sun like signal flares. Aldrich's Wolfguard took the center, their famed black cloaks billowing as they tested the weight of their axes. To their left, Harkon's cavalry milled impatiently, horses stamping at the mud. It should have been a textbook advance, crush the remnants of resistance, then march unopposed to the kingdom's heart, but the valley had other plans. Edrick's opening move was a masterpiece of misdirection. As the enemy trumpet sounded, his forces staged a chaotic retreat, or at least that's what it looked like. Shields clattered to the ground, voices shouted in panicked curses, and a handful of archers loosed wild volleys before fleeing up the western slope. To Aldrich's commanders, it was proof their enemies had finally cracked. The order came swift and smug: advance at double pace. What they didn't see were the ropes coiled in the grass, the freshly turned earth hiding pits lined with sharpened stakes, or the 200 silent bowmen crouching in the fog-shrouded tree line, their arrows dipped in tar. Then the valley struck back. The first wolf guard to hit the retreating force met no resistance, just empty armor propped on sticks, a crude scarecrow army. By the time they realized the ruse, the ground itself seemed to revolt. Hidden tripwires snapped, sending armored men sprawling into pits. The riverbanks, churned to slurry by Harkon's earlier crossings, became quicksand for heavy infantry. And from the trees, Edrick's archers unleashed a firestorm, literally. Those tar-tipped arrows ignited oil-soaked brush piles, funneling the enemy into killing zones where the smoke blinded them but guided the defenders' aim. The genius wasn't just in the traps, but the timing. Edrick had studied Aldrich's past battles and knew the Wolfguard always pushed forward after a feigned retreat, their discipline fraying into bloodlust. He'd also noted Harkon's habit of sending cavalry ahead to claim glory. So when the horsemen surged across the river, they found not fleeing troops but a wall of spears hidden behind a berm of loose soil, and worse, caltrops strewn in the shallows, their spikes shredding horses' hooves. The screams of wounded animals panicked the rest, sending riders crashing into each other in a tangle of flailing limbs and snapped lances. But the real masterstroke came from the terrain itself. The valley's narrow throat forced Aldrich's reinforcements to bottleneck, their numbers useless as they tripped over their own dead. Meanwhile, Edrick's light-footed skirmishers, many of them hunters and poachers before the war, moved like ghosts through the mist, picking off officers with brutal efficiency. One survivor's account describes the terror of it. They weren't soldiers. They were the woods biting back. By mid-morning, what should have been a triumphant march had devolved into a nightmare of friendly fire and frantic retreats, the invaders' once proud formations dissolving into mobs of terrified men. The lesson of Blackthorn Vale wasn't just about tactics, it was about psychology. Edrick didn't just outfight his enemies, he outthought them, weaponizing their arrogance until it became their fatal flaw. Every trap, every feint was designed to confirm what Aldrick and Harkon already believed, that victory was inevitable, and that, more than any arrow or spear, was what turned the tide. Because when the ground beneath your feet betrays you, and the air itself burns, even the mightiest army becomes a chorus of one panicked question: where do we run? The turning point came not with a trumpet's blast or a hero's cry, but with a single misstep, a stumble that rippled into disaster. Midway through the battle, Aldrich's Wolfguard had finally pushed past Edrick's traps, their discipline overcoming the chaos as they formed a shield wall at the valley's narrowest point. Victory was inches away, then the ground gave way. Days earlier, Edrick had ordered his men to dig shallow trenches along the vale's floor, covering them with woven mats of grass and loose soil. To the invaders, it looked like solid ground until the weight of 300 armored men hit it at once. The earth collapsed like rotted timber, swallowing the Wolfguard's front ranks into a pit of mud and hidden spikes. The survivors floundered, their heavy armor dragging them down as Edrick's archers rained fire from above. One chronicler later wrote, "It was as if the valley itself opened its jaws." But the true pivot came seconds later when Aldrich's standard-bearer, a grizzled veteran who'd fought in a dozen campaigns, tripped over a fallen comrade. The king's banner, that symbol of invincibility, toppled into the muck, In any other battle, it might have been raised again. Here, in the frenzy of smoke and screams, the sight of that fabric sinking into the filth struck like a lightning bolt. The Wolfguard wavered. Harkon's cavalry, already spooked by the carnage, misinterpreted the falling standard as a signal to retreat. Panic spread faster than the fires. Edrick, bleeding from a gash across his brow, seized the moment. He didn't order a charge. He simply stood atop a rock, roaring a line from an old drinking song. His men, recognizing the cue, took up the chorus. That ragged, off-key bellow became their battle cry. It wasn't skill or strategy that won the day then. It was the raw, defiant energy of men who refused to die quietly. The invaders, trained for orderly warfare, had no answer for this howling mob of farmers and deserters surging downhill with nothing left to lose. The irony. Aldrich's death came not from a noble duel, but from a shepherd's slingstone, a lucky shot from a boy who'd never held a sword. The king fell without ceremony, his body trampled underfoot as his army unraveled. Harkon, seeing the tide turn, fled with his surviving horsemen, though the river claimed half of them before they reached the far bank. By noon, what began as a certain victory had dissolved into a rout, the valley's slopes littered with the wreckage of an arrogance that forgot to respect the land and the desperation of those who knew it. That's the thing about pivotal moments in history. They're rarely clean or cinematic. They're messy, human, and often hinge on something as small as a slipping banner or a stone in the right hand at the right time. Blackthorn Vale didn't just change the course of a battle. It proved that even the mightiest tide can break against the will of those who have decided they have nowhere left to retreat. When we think of battles like Blackthorn Vale, the spotlight naturally falls on the warriors, the Edricks and Aldricks clashing steel in the mud. But dig deeper, and you'll find the real heartbeat of the fight wasn't just in the hands of soldiers. It pulsed in the calloused fingers of farmers who turned plowshares into barricades, in the whispered prayers of monks binding wounds with torn vestments, in the children who darted through enemy camps with false messages tucked into their sleeves. This wasn't just an army's victory, it was a kingdom's collective gasp for survival. Take the valley's shepherds, for instance. Days before the battle, they'd quietly guided Edrick's scouts through hidden trails, their knowledge of the land turning sheep paths into strategic routes. One account tells of an old herder named Pell who disguised pit traps as grazing hollows, luring Aldrich's scouts into questioning their own maps. Then there were the blacksmiths, not soldiers, but men who hammered caltrops through the night, their forges hidden in caves to muffle the sound. They didn't wear armor, but without their work, Harkon's cavalry would have ridden unchecked. Even the clergy played their part. A monastery just beyond the Vale became a covert hospital, its monks smuggling wounded fighters through crypts and wine cellars. Brother Caddoc, a scribe with no martial training, reportedly saved dozens by mixing poppy milk into wine barrels left for the enemy, an act of mercy disguised as sabotage, leaving entire squads groggy and slow to rally. And let's not forget the women of nearby villages who didn't just tend the wounded, but wove false intelligence into their gossip. A laundress's offhand remark about the king's reinforcements coming from the east sent Harkon's scouts chasing shadows for hours, buying Edrick precious time. But perhaps the most striking role fell to the children. Too young to fight, they became the kingdom's unseen messengers. A girl named Lissa, barely 10, carried orders between units in her breadbasket, her innocence disarming enemy patrols. Another boy, Tommen, climbed trees to signal troop movements with a shepherd's mirror until the day he was caught and pretended to be a simpleton chasing sunlight. His act was so convincing, the invaders laughed him off, never realizing they'd been outwitted by a child. This mosaic of ordinary courage rewrites what we assume about medieval warfare. Battles weren't won by swords alone, but by the collective will of everyone who had something to lose. When the smoke cleared at Blackthorn Vale, the survivors didn't just praise Edrick's tactics. They told stories of the baker who poisoned a bread shipment, the minstrel who sang coded warnings in taverns, the woodcutter who felled trees to block retreat paths. These weren't footnotes, they were the glue that held a desperate defense together. Because when a kingdom fights for its life, the line between soldier and civilian doesn't just blur, it vanishes. The moment the tide turned, the invaders' discipline shattered like glass under a hammer. What began as an orderly withdrawal dissolved into pure pandemonium, men trampling their own wounded in the mud, tossing aside swords and shields to sprint faster, officers bellowing unheard commands over the din of panic. One surviving diary from Aldrich's camp paints a chilling scene. The river Thresher, so shallow at dawn, became a death trap by noon. Horsemen drove their mounts straight into the current, only to vanish beneath the churn of 100 others behind them. The water ran red long before the bodies stopped washing ashore. For the kingdom's defenders, the sight was surreal. Farmers turned, soldiers gaped at the retreating tide of polished armor, their hands still trembling on bloodied spears. A young archer's letter home captures the disbelief. We expected to die here. Now we're watching wolves flee from sheep. Even Edrick, bleeding and exhausted atop a captured supply cart, reportedly muttered, "It can't be this easy," before ordering a cautious advance, half convinced the retreat was another ruse. But the truth was simpler. Armies built on arrogance have no blueprint for humiliation. The retreat's chaos birthed grim legends. Harkon's cavalry, famed for their discipline, became a mob of terrified riders, their horses bolting straight through their own infantry. One account tells of a Veldros knight so desperate to escape, he stripped off his armor mid-run, only to be recognized and cut down by his own men in the fog. Others drowned in unexpected depths. The river's bends, swollen by autumn rains, hid sinkholes that swallowed men whole. A shepherd boy later claimed to have found a drowned Wolfguard officer still clutching a gold-chased goblet, his last plunder weighing him down like an anchor. But the most telling detail, the abandoned baggage trains, priceless siege engines, chests of looted silver, even Aldrich's personal tent with its embroidered maps, all left behind as the invaders ran. Historians would later call it the Feast of the Desperate, as Edrick's starved men fell upon stores of wine and salted meat meant for a victory banquet. A royal scribe's dry note records the irony. The enemy brought their own feast to our funeral. Instead, they catered our rebirth. Yet amid the celebration, pockets of haunting humanity lingered. A wounded Veldros drummer boy, no older than 12, was found curled beneath a supply wagon, too terrified to move. Instead of a blade, he was given bread and sent stumbling home. Nearby, a pair of enemy knights' brothers by their insignia lay dead back to back in the reeds, their final stand ignored in the rout. These weren't just faceless invaders. They were men who'd marched expecting glory, only to find a valley that refused to be erased. As the sun dipped below the Vale's rim, the kingdom's survivors faced a strange emptiness. They'd prepared for death, not the awkward silence of survival. Men who'd kissed their own swords goodbye that morning now sat numbly on captured chests, picking at foreign delicacies they couldn't name. The air still stank of smoke and iron, but the dread had lifted, replaced by a dawning, almost uncomfortable realization. They'd bought more than a reprieve. They'd bought a future, and somewhere beyond the bloodied fields, the rest of the kingdom waited to learn whether their sacrifice had been enough. The silence after battle is never truly silent. Blackthorn Vale in those first hours was a landscape of groans, crackling flames, and the slow, methodic work of survivors sorting the living from the dead. Victory had come, but at a price that no tally could fully capture. The river Thresher, once clear enough to reflect the sky, now ran murky with blood and churned earth. its banks littered with the detritus of broken ambitions, shattered shields, trampled banners, and here and there, the glint of a discarded dagger half buried in the mud. Archaeologists centuries later would uncover the valley's secrets layer by layer. A mass grave near the eastern slope held the bones of nearly 200 men, their remains tangled in a grim embrace, some still clutching weapons or wearing the wolf-crested rings of Edrick's elite. More haunting were the smaller finds, a child's wooden toy wedged between rib cages, likely carried as a charm by a homesick soldier, a rusted medallion of the goddess of mercy hung around the neck of a man whose skull showed a brutal axe wound. These weren't just artifacts, they were echoes of individual lives cut short in a single, chaotic afternoon. The treatment of prisoners defied the era's usual brutality. Edrick's surviving orders, scrawled on a piece of looted parchment, read simply, "Feed them, question them, let the wounded go." Unlike the invaders who'd planned to enslave or execute captives, the kingdom's forces seemed to understand the battle's deeper stakes. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about proving they were more than the broken remnant their enemies had mocked. A captured Veldros lieutenant's journal reveals his shock. "They gave me broth from their own pot." When I asked why, one said, "So you can tell your children what mercy looks like." Yet the spoils of war told their own story. Among the reclaimed loot were chests of grain stamped with the kingdom's own insignia, food stolen during earlier raids now returned to starving villages. More poignant were the personal effects. A noblewoman's stolen dowry jewels, a farmer's deed to land Edrick had seized, even a reliquary containing the finger bone of a local saint. These weren't just treasures, they were fragments of a shattered identity, painstakingly pieced back together. The human toll lingered long after the last fires burned out. Local records speak of a year of ghosts, where survivors on both sides reported dreams of the Vale, not of battle, but of strange moments of connection. A Veldros soldier's letter, never sent, was found tucked in a dead man's boot. "I fought beside a boy today who reminded me of my brother. I don't think I'll tell our mother how he died." On the kingdom's side, a ballad written by a washerwoman turned field nurse survives. Its chorus a lament for the hands we held as they left, both friend and foe. Perhaps the most telling relic wasn't dug from the earth at all. In the monastery archives, a single sheet of vellum lists the names of the dead, not divided by allegiance, but grouped by the villages they hailed from. A scribe's note at the bottom reads, "So the land may remember its own," because in the end, Blackthorn Vale wasn't just a battlefield. It was a reckoning, one that forced both sides to confront the cost of pride and the fragile humanity that outlasts even the bloodiest of days. Victory at Blackthorn Vale didn't just stop the bleeding, it gave the kingdom a second breath, a chance to stitch itself back together before the next storm. In the months that followed, the once despised king, now buoyed by an unexpected surge of loyalty, made moves that would have been unthinkable before the battle. He pardoned rebellious nobles who'd fled, offering them land grants along the ravaged borders, a gamble that turned former rivals into frontline defenders. The treasury, though empty, was refilled not with taxes but with symbolic gestures. Melted down enemy armor recast into coins stamped with the Vale's silhouette, a daily reminder of what unity had won. But the real transformation wasn't just political, it was cultural. Blackthorn Vale became shorthand for resilience, a story told in taverns and nurseries alike. Bards swapped tales of Edrick's stand for older, gloomier ballads of defeat, turning the battle into something mythic. Never mind that the details grew hazier with each retelling. In one popular version, Edrick's sword burst into holy flame. In another, the river thresher rose up as a watery giant to smite the invaders. The truth was messy, but the legend was clean, a ragtag underdog defying annihilation. Artists painted the scene on Guildhall walls, always with the same dramatic sunset, never the blood-soaked mud. The kingdom's enemies took note. Edrick's successors, though humiliated, weren't foolish enough to dismiss the lesson. They shifted tactics, probing the borders with raids instead of full campaigns, testing whether the kingdom's new spine would hold. It did. Farmers who'd fought at the Vale now trained with militia captains, turning harvest scythes into makeshift polearms. Watchtowers sprang up along the frontier, not the towering stone citadels of old, but simple wooden ones, easy to rebuild, harder to surprise. Most strikingly, the victory rewrote the kingdom's sense of itself. Before the battle, chroniclers referred to the realm as the Fading Crown. Afterward, scribes adopted a new phrase, the Unbroken Circle. Even the royal seals changed, the old lion crest now ringed by a band of thorns. It was more than symbolism, it was a declaration that survival had forged something tougher than gold or steel. And yet, for all its rebirth, the kingdom never forgot the cost. Every autumn, when the valley's blackthorn bushes bloomed white, villagers would leave loaves of bread at crossroads, a silent offering to the dead on both sides. Not for glory, not for vengeance, but because survival, they'd learned, was a fragile thing. The battle had bought them time, but time, as they now knew, was just another battlefield. History has a strange way of remembering what serves its storytellers and forgetting what doesn't. Blackthorn Vale's disappearance from the record books wasn't an accident. It was the result of forces far bigger than the battle itself. For starters, the kingdom had every reason to downplay its desperation. Imagine you've just survived a knife fight by the skin of your teeth. Do you brag about how close you came to losing, or do you focus on the fact you're still standing? Official chronicles glossed over the near collapse, spinning the victory as a bold defense rather than a last gasp. Court poets wrote verses about the king's wisdom, not the disgraced knight who actually turned the tide. It's no coincidence that Edrick's name barely appears in royal archives until decades later, when the truth had softened into legend. Then there's the inconvenient timing. Blackthorn Vale happened in the shadow of far flashier conflicts, the kind with crowned heads clashing over glittering prizes. While Edrick's ragtag band was holding a muddy valley, empires were rising and falling in grand sieges that reshaped borders. Historians of the era were drawn to the sweeping narratives, the kind where kings dictated terms in gilded tents, not some grimy skirmish where the real hero died anonymous in the dirt. It's like comparing a street brawl to a championship fight. Both are violent, but only one gets the spotlight. But the deepest reason might be the battle's own messy humanity. Great victories are supposed to be clean, heroic, ordained by destiny. Blackthorn Vale was none of those things. It was one with traps and tricks, by men who fought not for glory, but because they'd run out of places to retreat. The kingdom's later rulers had little interest in celebrating a victory that relied on peasants and deception. Far better to memorialize the polished, chivalrous battles where knights in shining armor followed the rules. Never mind that those noble clashes usually ended in stalemates or Pyrrhic wins. They fit the story the powerful wanted to tell about themselves. Compare it to the famous Battle of Harrowfield, fought just 20 years later with all the pageantry historians adore. Two kings met on an open plain, their banners fluttering, their declarations recorded by scribes. Harrowfield's outcome changed nothing. It was a draw, but it filled chronicles because it looked the part. Blackthorn Vale decided a kingdom's fate, yet it lacked the stagecraft to be remembered. Even the landscape conspired to erase the evidence. Unlike castle sieges or open field clashes, the Vale left few dramatic ruins, no shattered towers or mass graves marked with monuments. The pits were filled in, the trenches reclaimed by brambles, Within a generation, farmers were grazing sheep on ground that had swallowed armies. Memory needs anchors, stones, statues, something to point at and say, here's where it happened. Without them, even the most pivotal moments can dissolve into folklore. Perhaps the greatest irony, the very desperation that saved the kingdom also doomed its place in history. Victories born of grit and ingenuity don't inspire the same awe as those won by destiny or divine right. We remember Thermopylae because 300 Spartans chose to die heroically. We forget the 1,000 other stands where the underdogs won ugly and walked away. Blackthorn Vale's legacy wasn't erased by malice, just by the quiet, relentless tide of stories that better fit the narratives we prefer to tell about the past. And in that, it's far from alone. For every battle that shapes our textbooks, there are a dozen more, equally pivotal, waiting in the weeds for someone to dig them up. The story of Blackthorn Vale might have stayed buried forever, if not for a series of unlikely discoveries, each one a tiny key unlocking pieces of a puzzle no one knew existed. It began with a rainstorm. In the late 19th century, a landslide near the valley exposed a mass grave, its bones jumbled with fragments of armor and a single, rusted sword bearing Edrick's wolf crest. Local antiquarians dismissed it as just another skirmish, but one curious historian, a professor named Elias Varro, noticed something odd. The skeletons showed no signs of ritual burial. They'd been dumped haphazardly, some still clutching weapons. That didn't fit the era's chivalric customs. His hunch sent him digging through crumbling monastery ledgers, where he found a scribbled margin note, "Blackthorn, where the earth drank kings." Then came the pollen. Decades later, a team studying medieval climate patterns took core samples from the valley's peat bogs. Buried beneath layers of sediment, they found an unnatural concentration of charcoal and ragweed pollen, telltale signs of sudden deforestation followed by rapid regrowth. Radiocarbon dating placed the event squarely in the kingdom's darkest decade, but the real breakthrough, a thin layer of fermented barley residue in the same stratum. Someone had spilled a lot of ale there, likely from shattered casks, evidence of a camp overrun mid-celebration. The most dramatic find, though, came from an unexpected place, a pawn shop in a neighboring country. In 2005, a doctoral student browsing for vintage coins noticed a peculiar silver piece stamped with thorns encircling a lion. The shopkeeper shrugged, some old war souvenir, but the student recognized the kingdom's post-Vale emblem. Tracing its origins led to a cache of letters hidden behind a false panel in a noble family's attic, including a first-hand account from Harkon's own scribe. We marched in expecting a feast. The valley fed us ashes instead, but perhaps the quietest revelation was the most poignant. In a remote chapel's archive, a conservator restoring a damaged psalter found ghostly writing beneath the vellum, scraped off notes reused by a frugal monk. Under ultraviolet light, the erased text emerged, a casualty list naming Edrick and 47 others, followed by the phrase, "Who held the thorns so we might keep the rose." These fragments, scattered across centuries and continents, didn't just reconstruct a battle, they revealed how history gets filtered. Official records had glorified the king's later reforms, while the messy, desperate truth of the Vale survived in margins, mud, and mistakes. Every discovery was a correction, a whisper from the past insisting, "Don't forget, we were here too." Edrick of Dunhold didn't just win a battle, he rewrote the playbook on leadership under fire. What makes his story so compelling isn't the sword strokes or the traps, but the way he turned desperation into a strategy. Here's the thing about true leadership. It's not about having the most resources, it's about making the most of what you've got. And Edrick's choices that day in Blackthorn Vale reveal principles that could fill a modern CEO's handbook. Take adaptability. When the enemy expected a traditional defense, shield walls, fortified positions, Edrick gave them chaos. He didn't just react to the battlefield, he reshaped it, literally. Those hidden trenches, they weren't dug the night before. Scouts later found evidence they'd been weeks in the making, disguised as irrigation channels. While Aldrich's commanders obsessed over capturing supply routes, Edrick studied the land itself, the way morning fog pooled in the valley's dips, how the river's currents shifted after rain. Modern leaders call this environmental scanning, but Edrick knew it as survival. Whether you're steering a medieval garrison or a tech startup through a market crash, the lesson's the same. The map isn't just the territory, it's your first weapon. Then there's morale. Armies and companies crumble when belief does. Edrick's genius wasn't just in lifting spirits, it was in weaponizing humility, that moment when he laughed at the odds. It wasn't bravado. Chroniclers note how he gathered his men the night before and said, "They think we're nothing. Good, let's surprise them." He turned their underdog status into an advantage, something today's leaders miss when they spin empty positivity. Think of the CEO who admits, "We're outmatched, but we know things they don't." That's Edrick's play. When a team owns their limitations, they stop fearing them. But the masterstroke was how he exploited the enemy's greatest strength, their arrogance, and made it their fatal flaw. Aldrich's Wolfguard trained for set-piece battles, so Edrick gave them a brawl. Harkon's cavalry prized speed, so he bogged them down in mud. In business terms, he forced his competitors to play a game they didn't recognize. That's why Blackthorn Vale resonates with modern disruptors. From startups outmaneuvering giants to activists toppling entrenched systems. The principle's timeless. Never fight your rival's battle. Change the rules so their strengths become liabilities. Here's where medieval and modern leadership diverge, though. Today's executives love quoting Sun Tzu on knowing the enemy, but Edrick added a twist. He knew his enemy better than they knew themselves. Those abandoned wine casks left for Aldrich's troops. They weren't just traps, they were psychological warfare. Edrick had heard stories of the Wolfguard's drunken revels after victories, so he let them find looted alcohol spiked with mild sedatives. Not enough to incapacitate, just enough to slow reflexes come dawn. Modern negotiators use similar tactics, studying an opponent's habits to predict their moves. The takeaway: data wins wars, whether it's scouting reports or analytics dashboards. Yet for all the cunning, what cemented Edrick's leadership was something harder to quantify: trust. He didn't command from the rear, he ate the same thin gruel as his men, slept in the same muddy tents. When the final charge came, he didn't shout, "Attack." He grabbed a spear and ran first. That's why his ragtag force held when professional armies would have broken. Today's equivalent isn't the boss who takes a symbolic pay cut. It's the manager who shares the midnight oil during a crunch, the politician who visits disaster zones before the cameras arrive. Authenticity isn't a leadership buzzword. It's the glue that holds desperate people together. The eerie parallel: both Edrick and Aldrich faced the same crisis, a battle they couldn't afford to lose. One adapted, the other assumed. That's the razor's edge leadership walks every day, whether in a medieval valley or a corporate boardroom. Because history's darkest hours aren't decided by who has the most resources, but by who best understands the ground beneath their feet and the people standing on it with them. The fragile threads of history rarely snap with a dramatic flourish. They simply fray unnoticed until one day they're gone. Blackthorn Vale's near erasure from memory isn't an anomaly, it's the rule. For every battle that reshapes kingdoms and fills textbooks, there are a dozen more buried under layers of time, their lessons dissolved like ink in rain. Think of the countless turning points that never made it into the chronicles, the nameless sieges where one more hour of resistance could have changed everything. the forgotten treaties signed by candlelight, the whispered alliances between farmers and knights that held borders together when crowns could not. These aren't just gaps in the record, they're missing pieces of humanity's collective compass. Consider how history gets written in the first place. The victors draft the first drafts, yes, but even they curate. A king's scribe might immortalize a glorious charge while omitting the dysentery that crippled half the army. A monk transcribing events adds divine favor where there was only luck. And what of the stories that never found a scribe at all? The shepherd who spotted the enemy's approach but couldn't read or write to leave a warning for the next generation. The battle might be won, but the wisdom of how it was won, the gritty, unheroic truths often dies with those who lived it. This isn't just about lost battles. It's about the fragility of cause and effect. We marvel at the unbroken chain of events that led to our modern world, but how many of those links were nearly missed? The kingdom's survival at Blackthorn Vale hinged on a disgraced knight's knowledge of terrain, a river's unpredictable currents, a child's slingshot finding its mark. Alter any of those threads and the tapestry unravels. Now imagine all the other threads we'll never know about, the near misses and almost wares that quietly shaped civilizations before vanishing into the void. The irony is brutal. The moments that feel most insignificant in their time often matter the most in hindsight. A clerk misplacing a supply order could doom an army. A storm delaying a messenger might save a city. Yet these microscopic pivots rarely make the chronicles, because history favors the sweeping arc over the stray spark. We remember the earthquakes, not the tremors that warned of them, until the day the ground opens up without warning. Perhaps the real lesson of Blackthorn Vale isn't about how battles are won, but about how easily we lose the wisdom of those who won them. Every era assumes its own survival was inevitable, that the past's narrow escapes were just preludes to their present. But dig deeper, and you'll find the truth. Civilization is a candle flickering in the wind, and the gusts that almost blew it out are far more numerous than the ones we've recorded. The question isn't just what we've forgotten, it's how many times forgetting almost cost us everything. The soil of Blackthorn Vale still whispers its secrets to those who know how to listen, not in words, but in the language of rusted iron and splintered bone. Take that dented helmet found wedged between tree roots near the riverbank, its wolf crest half melted by fire. At first glance, it's just another relic. But tilt it toward the light and the story sharpens. The dent isn't from a sword, it's from a rock the kind shepherds hurled from the slopes. The soot patterns suggest it wasn't just knocked off in battle, it was stripped from a fleeing man, tossed aside as dead weight. These aren't just artifacts, they're frozen moments of panic preserved in metal. Then there's the arrowhead-laden field where even now, a casual stroll turns up triangular slivers of iron nestled in the dirt like grim confetti. Modern ground-penetrating radar reveals their pattern wasn't random. They clustered in crescent-shaped kill zones, proof of Edrick's archers firing in disciplined volleys from the tree line. But the real revelation came when archaeologists matched the arrowheads to the wounds on excavated skeletons. Most were standard broadheads, but a handful were barbed hunting tips, the kind peasants used to bring down deer. That detail alone rewrote assumptions about the battle's participants. This wasn't just a soldier's fight, it was a community's last stand, with every able hand contributing whatever they had. The most telling clue, though, isn't on the battlefield, it's in the woods. Those hastily built fortifications turned out to be far more calculated than they appeared. Core samples from the valley's eastern slope show tree rings with abrupt growth spurts after the battle year. Translation: Edrick's men didn't just chop down trees for barricades, they targeted specific groves, leaving stumps that regrew into a living map of their defense lines. Even the notches on surviving timber tell a story. Tool marks indicate they were felled with a mix of proper axes and repurposed farming implements, some still bearing the nicks of earlier harvests. But perhaps the quietest witness is the river itself. Sediment layers from that year contain an anomaly, a spike in lead particles far higher than normal for the era. Turns out the kingdom's smiths had melted down every scrap of scrap metal they could find, including lead-sealed storage barrels, to forge last-minute weapons. That chemical fingerprint, invisible to medieval chroniclers, confirms something no parchment could. This wasn't an army making a stand. It was a people inventing an army from whatever lay at hand. These fragments, each one a syllable in a larger sentence, paint a picture no chronicle could capture. The official records talk of tactics and troop movements. The artifacts tell of desperation and ingenuity, of men who turned sheep paths into ambush routes and harvest tools into weapons. They remind us that history isn't just written by the victors. Sometimes it's written in the bends of a riverbank, the rings of a tree, or the way a single arrowhead, lifted from the mud after 8 centuries, still carries the weight of the hand that loosed it. Every legend grows taller with time, and Blackthorn Vale is no exception. Over the centuries, the battle morphed from a desperate stand into something closer to myth, tales of Edrick single-handedly slaying 100 men, of divine fire raining from the heavens to smite the invaders, even of the river itself rising up as a watery avenger. These stories aren't just exaggerations, they're layers of varnish obscuring the real, far more compelling truth. Because what actually happened in that valley wasn't supernatural, it was human. And in many ways that makes it more extraordinary. Take the infamous Slope of 1,000 Arrows, where bards sang of Edrick's archers blotting out the sun with their volleys. Archaeological soil samples tell a different story. The concentration of arrowheads found in the eastern kill zone suggests no more than 200 bowmen, a far cry from the legendary host. But here's what the poetry misses. Those archers weren't trained military specialists. Many were hunters and farmers using homemade bows, their arrows fletched with chicken feathers rather than the uniform goose quills of professional armies. Their accuracy wasn't born from drill yards but from lifetimes spent tracking game through these very woods. The real miracle wasn't the number of arrows, it was how few it took to turn the tide when every shot counted. Then there's the enduring image of Edrick as a lone hero cutting through enemy ranks like a scythe through wheat. Weapon analysis paints a messier picture. The sword recovered near the mass grave likely shows signs of brutal, unrefined use. The nicks and bends suggest it wasn't wielded with knightly finesse, but with the raw, chopping force of a man fighting for his life. Forensic studies of the skeletons nearby reveal most died from ambush wounds, arrows to the back, spear thrusts from hidden positions, even blunt trauma from rocks hurled from above. This wasn't a glorious duel, it was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare where terrain and cunning mattered more than individual prowess. Even the valley's supposed divine intervention has an earthly explanation. Those miraculous morning fogs that blinded the invaders, whether records reconstructed from tree rings show autumns in that region were notoriously damp, with temperature inversions trapping mist in the valley until midday. Edrick didn't pray for cover, he used what the land gave him. As for the river that drowned the wicked, hydrological surveys prove the Thresher's currents shifted unpredictably after heavy rains, its gravel beds hiding sudden drop-offs. The invaders, unfamiliar with its quirks, charged straight into nature's trap. But perhaps the most persistent myth is the idea that this was a battle of pure desperation, won by luck as much as skill. Metallurgical analysis of recovered weapons tells another story. The kingdom's smiths had secretly reforged every scrap of available iron plowshares, door hinges, even cooking pots into serviceable blades. These weren't the crude implements of a beaten people, they were the tools of a society refusing to die. Arrowheads show evidence of being heat-treated for hardness, spear tips were weighted for balance, and the infamous caltrops were precision cast to maim rather than just slow. This wasn't luck, it was preparation meeting opportunity. The truth, stripped of legend, is this: Blackthorn Vale wasn't won by a hero or the gods, it was won by ordinary people making extraordinary choices. A blacksmith staying up all night to hammer out one more blade, a shepherdess leading scouts through hidden trails, a disgraced knight who remembered the land could fight alongside him. These aren't the stuff of epic poems, but they're the marrow of real history, the kind that doesn't just inspire but teaches, because when we strip away the myth, what's left isn't less remarkable. It's more human, and that, in the end, is the story worth remembering. Long after the last sword was sheathed, Blackthorn Vale clung to the kingdom's imagination like a scar that never quite faded. You won't find it in royal chronicles anymore, but wander into the right village tavern or stumble upon a harvest festival in the region's backcountry, and you'll catch whispers of it, threads of memory woven into the fabric of everyday life. Take the Thorn Dance, performed every autumn in the valley's shadow. On the surface, it's just peasants in makeshift armor twirling blackthorn branches. But watch closely, the steps mimic shield formations, the sudden crouch and leap mirrors Edrick's ambush tactics. No one calls it a war reenactment, they've forgotten why they do it at all. Yet the rhythm persists, passed down like a heartbeat. Then there are the place names, those quiet keepers of secrets. A farmer's field marked Fox's Lair on old deeds. That's where Edrick's scouts supposedly hid. The tavern called the Broken Banner near the river. Local lore claims it's where Aldrich's standard washed ashore. Even children's games echo the battle unknowingly, a regional variant of hide and seek called Wolf and Thorn, where the hiders leave trails of crushed berries to mislead. The rules make no sense unless you know they're replaying Edrick's deception tactics with boar's blood and broken brush. But the most haunting relic isn't carved in stone or danced in festivals. It's stitched into a moth-eaten tapestry hanging in a noble family's dusty hall. At first glance, it's just a hunting scene, knights, hounds, a boar at bay. Look closer. The boar's tusks are suspiciously wolf-like, the trees behind it shaped into spears. The border's thorns coil into letters too faded to read, except one corner where the thread still screams. Dunhold, Edrick's lost family name. The noble who owns it shrugs when asked. Some ancestor's vanity, he says. He doesn't know he's sitting beneath a battle manifesto in wool and dye. Even the ballads twisted with time. A drinking song called The Shepherdess Revenge survives in fragments, its lyrics about a maiden outsmarting wolves with slingshots. Only scholars notice the parallels to Lyssa, the real child messenger who blinded Aldrich's scout with a pebble. The most chilling verse, "The river drinks what the king denies," almost certainly references the drowned wolf god, though singers today just cheer the catchy rhyme. What's remarkable isn't that these fragments exist, but how they've been hollowed out, stories stripped of context, rituals divorced from meaning. The battle didn't vanish, it dissolved into the groundwater of culture, feeding roots no one remembers planting. Walk the Vale now, and you'll find picnickers lounging on grass that once sucked at bloodied boots, kids skipping stones where armored men sank. The land moved on. But sometimes when the mist rolls in just right and the blackthorn blooms crack open, you can almost hear the old refrain beneath the laughter, "Let them remember we stood." Even if no one does, the echoes of Blackthorn Vale reverberate far beyond medieval battlefields. They whisper through modern conflicts where underdogs still defy the odds, where terrain and ingenuity can humble the mighty. Think of the Ukrainian farmers towing away Russian tanks with their tractors in 2022, or the Vietnamese guerrilla fighters weaving through jungles American technology couldn't penetrate. The same principles that saved a crumbling kingdom 8 centuries ago still apply today. Know your ground better than your enemy does, turn their strengths into vulnerabilities, and never underestimate the power of people fighting for their homes. What makes these parallels so chilling is how easily we forget them. Just as Blackthorn Vale faded from memory, today's asymmetrical struggles, Kurdish militias holding mountain passes against larger forces, or Yemeni rebels repurposing drones to disrupt oil fields, rarely make headlines until they've already shifted history's course. Military academies teach grand maneuvers and tank battles, but the real lessons often come from places like the Syrian town of Kobani, where street-by-street resistance against overwhelming force rewrote the playbook on urban warfare. These aren't just footnotes, they're proof that the rules of conflict are written by whoever dares to break them first. Consider the unpredictability factor. Aldrich's commanders never imagined a disgraced knight, and a handful of peasants could outmaneuver them, just as colonial powers never anticipated Afghan tribesmen using 19th century rifles to pick off 21st century helicopters. The through line is arrogance. Whether it's a medieval king dismissing a muddy valley or a modern superpower assuming superior tech guarantees victory, the result is the same. The overconfident stumble into traps laid by those they considered beneath notice. Yet there's a darker thread here. Blackthorn Vale survived in folklore because the kingdom endured, but what of the battles lost to time because the defenders didn't? For every Ukraine-style resistance that captures global attention, there are a dozen untold stories like the Rohingyas' makeshift bamboo spears against military jets, or the Western Sahara's 40-year guerrilla war waged from sand dunes. History remembers what serves its narratives, and the margins are littered with struggles erased before they could become inspiration. So here's the uncomfortable question. What Blackthorn Vales are unfolding right now, unnoticed, in Myanmar's jungles where PDF militias forge homemade rifles to fight a junta? In Sudan's deserts, where drone hobbyists track militia movements with repurposed smartphones, these aren't hypotheticals, they're living chapters in humanity's oldest story, the weak finding ways to resist the strong. The real lesson isn't just about medieval tactics, it's about recognizing that the battles destined to shape our future are often the ones we're not even watching yet. And that's how the wheel turns, not with a roar, but with a whisper from the forgotten corners where desperation meets ingenuity. The aftermath of Blackthorn Vale wasn't just measured in bodies or broken swords, it was etched into the land itself, a scar so deep the ecosystem would take generations to heal. Picture the valley in the battle's wake, slopes stripped bare of trees for barricades and firewood, their stumps oozing sap like tears. The river Thresher, once clear enough to reflect the sky, now ran sluggish and brown, its currents clogged with shattered shields, discarded armor, and worse. Local herders later spoke of fish floating belly up for miles downstream, their gills choked by blood and iron sediment. War doesn't just kill people, it murders geography. What's often overlooked is how medieval warfare weaponized nature itself. Those pits Edrick's men dug weren't just traps, they gutted the valley's fragile topsoil, leaving erosion scars still visible in satellite images today. The Invaders' siege engines, dragged from miles away, required entire groves of oak to build, leaving behind stumps the width of wagon wheels. A monk's diary from the era notes the eerie silence in the weeks after the battle. No birdsong, just the creak of carrion crows and the crackle of still smoldering brush piles. Even the seasons seemed to rebel. tree ring studies show stunted growth for years afterward, likely from ash-choked rains leaching poison into the earth. But the most haunting changes were invisible. Soil samples reveal spikes in lead and iron concentrations, not from natural deposits, but from thousands of arrowheads, sword fragments, and armor scraps corroding into the groundwater. Modern archaeologists call it battlefield leaching, a toxic legacy that stunted crops for decades. Farmers reported wheat stalks growing twisted and hollow, as if the land itself had been wounded. And then there were the mass graves. Unlike the neat, consecrated burial mounds of later wars, these were hurried trenches, their contents churning up during spring floods for centuries, scattering bones across fields like grim fertilizer. The ecological toll reshaped the region's destiny. Deforestation from the battle and its aftermath forced survivors to switch from timber-based industries to sheep herding, altering the local economy forever. The Thresher's fish populations took nearly 50 years to recover, pushing villagers to rely on salt-preserved meats instead of fresh catches. Even the wildlife-adapted foxes grew bolder, scavenging battle scraps until they'd no fear of humans, while wolves, drawn by the carnage, became such a menace that the kingdom funded a years-long cull. Yet nature has its own resilience. The blackthorn bushes that gave the vale its name were the first to return, their thorny thickets thriving in the disturbed soil. Today, they bloom unnaturally white each spring, a phenomenon botanists attribute to minerals from decomposed weapons enriching the earth. It's a poetic twist. The very plants that symbolize the battle's brutality became agents of renewal, their roots stitching the land back together one fiber at a time. Because while war bends ecosystems to breaking, life always finds a way to rewrite itself, even if the story lingers in the dirt long after the storytellers are gone. Among the blood and chaos of Blackthorn Vale, there were faces, real people whose lives twisted and turned in the battle's wake, leaving trails we can still trace today if we know where to look. Take Brother Aldwin, for instance. Before he took holy vows, he was Aldrick of the Wolf Guard, one of the few survivors of his doomed unit. His journal, hidden for centuries behind a monastery's altar, tells of a man shattered by what he saw in the valley. "We marched in as lions," he wrote. "We crawled out as ghosts." The pages detail how he abandoned his sword at the river's edge, walked barefoot to the nearest abbey, and begged for sanctuary, not as a penitent but as a man who'd seen the hollowness of glory. The monks, sensing his torment, put him to work scrubbing bloodstains from the cloister floors. It was there, on his knees with a bucket and brush, that he reportedly had his revelation. "The valley didn't break me. It scrubbed me clean." His later sermons, fragments of which survive, never mentioned the battle by name, only "the day the earth refused us." Then there's the prisoner's account, a fragile scroll found stuffed inside a wine barrel in Harkon's abandoned camp. The writer, a captured kingdom archer named Elias, turned his confinement into an act of defiance. Using charcoal and stolen parchment, he documented everything: the layout of the enemy camp, the morale of the troops, even the weather patterns. But the most poignant entry is his description of the night before the battle, watching Edrick move through the ranks. "He didn't promise us life," Elias wrote. "He promised us a choice, to die on our knees or stand long enough to matter." The scroll's edges are singed, suggesting Elias tried to burn it rather than let it be captured again. He failed, and in failing, left us a window into the quiet courage of ordinary men staring down annihilation. But not all survivors' tales ended in redemption. In a village just beyond the Vale, census records show a sudden influx of battle-sick men in the years after, likely what we'd now call PTSD sufferers. One local midwife's ledger notes an uptick in stillbirths and moon madness, her term for night terrors. A shepherd's will from the period bequeaths his flock to his sons but adds a chilling addendum. If the black dogs come again, run for the high caves and do not look back. These fragments hint at wounds that never fully healed, at victories that came with invisible scars. The most unexpected survivor story belongs to Lissa, the girl who'd carried messages in her breadbasket. She grew up to become the kingdom's first recorded female guildmaster, running a network of couriers who all used the same trick she'd pioneered, hiding scrolls in loaves. When asked in her old age how she'd outlived so many stronger warriors, she allegedly smiled and said, "They were trained to fight armies. I was raised to outsmart hungry brothers." Her guild's symbol, a blackthorn branch entwined with wheat. These lives, pulled from the margins of history, remind us that battles aren't won by strategies alone. They're won by the grit of individuals making impossible choices. A monk's vow, a prisoner's charcoal scratches, a shepherdess's cunning, these aren't footnotes. They're the pulse beats of history, the proof that even in war's darkest hour, humanity persists. Because when the dust settles, what lingers isn't just the clash of steel, but the echo of 1,000 small acts of courage, each one whispering, "We were here." Blackthorn Vale didn't just change the fate of a kingdom, it quietly rewrote the rulebook of medieval warfare, introducing brutal innovations that would echo across battlefields for centuries. The most infamous, the thorn hedge, a deceptively simple tactic where defenders wove felled branches and sharpened stakes into movable barricades, creating instant kill zones. Unlike static fortifications, these could be repositioned under cover of darkness, turning open ground into death traps by dawn. Within decades, variations appeared in sieges from Constantinople to the Crusader states, often misattributed to later generals. But the real genius lay in their improvisation. Edrick's men used whatever the valley provided: blackthorn bushes, splintered cartwheels, even the invaders' own discarded spears. It was asymmetrical warfare centuries before the term existed, proving that ingenuity could outweigh resources. Then there was the shepherd's volley, a tactic born from necessity when Edrick realized his ragtag archers lacked the discipline for synchronized firing. Instead of orderly ranks, he had them loose arrows in staggered bursts from hidden positions, creating the illusion of overwhelming numbers. The chaos unnerved Aldrich's troops, who expected traditional volleys. By the 100 Years' War, English longbowmen would perfect this as the harrow shot, but its roots trace back to those misty slopes where hunters turned. Soldiers made every arrow count. Even the humble slingshot, often dismissed as a peasant's tool, proved devastating in the Vale's confines. Modern reconstructions show a well-hurled stone could dent helmets at 50 paces, a fact the Swiss would later exploit with their deadly halberdiers. But perhaps the most enduring innovation was psychological. Edrick's use of controlled routes, feigned retreats luring enemies into prearranged traps, became textbook strategy in conflicts from Agincourt to Napoleon's campaigns. What made Blackthorn Vale unique was the scale of deception. Before the battle, his men staged fake desertions, letting themselves be captured, while spreading disinformation about weak points in their lines. A recovered Veldros scout's report reads like parody. Their left flank collapses at the slightest pressure. That flank, of course, was where the pits lay waiting. The Mongols would later refine this into an art form, but the blueprint emerged here in a battle too obscure to credit. The real tragedy, these breakthroughs were nearly lost. Chroniclers of grander wars absorbed the tactics without attribution, like intellectual pillagers stripping a tomb. By the time Machiavelli penned The Art of War, the thorn hedge had become Swiss pike squares. The shepherd's volley morphed into English arrow storms. Even the controlled route got rebranded as feigned flight. its origins buried under layers of borrowed glory, only in fragments, a mercenary's diary referencing the Black Veil trick, a siege engineer's sketch of movable thorns do the connections surface. Because history, like Victor's, prefers its innovations to come from marble halls, not muddy fields where desperate men turned shepherds cunning into salvation. Imagine the kingdom's banner sinking into the mud at Blackthorn Vale for the last time, not as a rallying point, but as a relic buried under foreign boots. Aldrich's Wolfguard wouldn't have just claimed the valley, they'd have unraveled an entire civilization. Within months, the kingdom's heartlands would have been carved into fiefdoms for Veldro's warlords, its libraries burned as heathen nonsense, its language banned in favor of northern dialects. Archaeologists tracing this alternate path point to eerie parallels, the obliteration of the Dravani culture in the 9th century, where conquest erased everything from pottery designs to burial rites within 2 generations. The kingdom's fate would have been worse, not just erased but overwritten, its history recast as a cautionary tale about weak rulers who deserved collapse. But the true shockwave would have rippled far beyond borders. This kingdom wasn't just another medieval state, it was a linchpin. Its fertile river valleys fed 3 neighboring realms, its silver mines bankrolled trade from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Without it, the economic web of the region frays. Picture a 14th century Europe where the Hanseatic League never rises because the silver routes dried up decades earlier. Imagine the Crusades faltering without this kingdom's knights, who made up a third of the famed Iron Phalanx at Jerusalem. Even the Black Death might have spread differently. The kingdom's quarantine laws, later adopted across the continent, would have died with its collapse, potentially leaving ports unchecked as plague ships arrived. Culturally, the void would have been staggering. The kingdom's monasteries were copying ancient texts while Charlemagne's scribes still fumbled with parchment. Its collapse would have meant losing Aristotle's physics and Galen's medical treatises centuries before the Renaissance rediscovered them. Modern scholars estimate half the surviving Celtic sagas were preserved through this kingdom's scriptoriums. Without them, figures like Cu Chulainn might exist only as half-remembered tavern tales. Even the church would have fractured differently. This realm's bishops brokered the Compromise of Rouen, which kept the papal schism from spiraling into full-scale war. No kingdom, no compromise, just a divided Christendom ripe for exploitation. Then there's the geopolitical nightmare. With the kingdom gone, Veldros wouldn't have stopped at its borders. Its armies, flush with victory, would have turned east toward the fractured principalities of the Carpathian Basin. No Blackthorn Vale means no buffer state to slow the Mongol advance in 1241, just open plains for Batu Khan's horsemen to gallop straight into Vienna a decade early. The domino effect spirals, weaker Hungarian resistance, a fragmented Holy Roman Empire, perhaps even a Mongol foothold on the Adriatic. Suddenly, the Renaissance isn't flowering in Florence, it's smothered under hoofbeats and tribute demands. Yet the most haunting loss might be intangible. This kingdom's legal codes, progressive for their time, protected merchant rights, limited noble privilege, and even allowed peasant appeals against unjust lords. Those ideas, carried by traders and scholars, seeded reforms from Normandy to Novgorod. Without them, the Magna Carta might have remained a noble whim rather than a precedent. Serfdom could have calcified for another century. The very concept of rights might have worn a different face, shaped by Veldro's rigid caste system instead of this realm's messy, pragmatic justice. The chilling truth, we've seen glimpses of this erased world in our own timeline. When the Library of Alexandria burned, it wasn't just scrolls lost, it was entire branches of human thought snapped off. Blackthorn Vale's failure would have been another Alexandrian moment, but with bloodier consequences, because kingdoms aren't just lines on maps or names in chronicles. They're living networks of ideas, trade, and choices, each collapse 1,000 possible futures snuffed out. And that's why that forgotten battle matters. Not because of who won, but because of all the worlds that didn't get to exist when the thorns held firm. This forgotten battle wasn't just steel meeting steel under a stormy sky. It was the moment a flickering candle refused to be snuffed out. Think of all that hung in the balance that day, the manuscripts in scriptoriums that would have burned, the songs in taverns that would have faded into silence, the children who wouldn't have been born to carry their ancestors' stories forward. Blackthorn Vale didn't just save a kingdom, it preserved an entire ecosystem of culture. The language you're hearing right now, it might sound utterly different today if not for the stubborn few who held that valley. Dialects, laws, even the way farmers planted their fields, all of it balanced on the edge of a few thousand desperate decisions. What's haunting is how easily it could have vanished from memory. History shelves are stuffed with tales of kings and conquests, but the quiet battles, the ones fought by shepherds and half-starved garrisons, rarely make the cut. That's the irony. We remember the thunder, but the lightning strikes that change everything often go unseen. Imagine standing in the British Museum today, staring at a display labeled "Lost Civilization of the Blackthorn Vale." Because that's the alternate timeline one where no one bothered to write down the names of the farmers who stood in the mud with pitchforks and prayer. Here's the unsettling truth: Blackthorn Vale isn't unique. For every battle like this that we've pieced together from scraps, there are a dozen more still buried. The siege that saved a religion, the skirmish that kept a dying language alive, the nameless stand that gave a scientist one more year to finish his calculations. These aren't footnotes, they're the hidden load-bearing walls of history. And the scary part, we don't even know what we've forgotten. So next time you walk past an unmarked field or skim over a faded monument, pause. That patch of grass might be someone else's Blackthorn Vale, a place where the world almost turned differently. Because history isn't just the roar of the crowd, it's also the whisper of the overlooked. And those whispers, they're still out there, waiting for someone to lean in and listen. Like and subscribe to join us as we keep digging. After all, the past has more secrets than it's told, and the next one could change how you see